All right. Good afternoon. I hope everybody's doing really well. Wanted to come on and record the last lecture on for our text, chapter 14, generalization. And so we'll talk about external validity. We'll talk about how we use generalization in research and why generalization is really important. Over the last several centuries, we've used research as a means to um, tell us about what's going on in our society, in our environments. And so we use our research to um, use our inference statistics that we talked about in chapter 12 and 13, and we use those statistics then to generalize to the general public, right? So if we do a study on um, self-esteem, right, we'll take a sample of students or take a sample out of the population. We'll do some research on that particular sample. And then once we get our results, we are hopeful that those results can be generalized to the general population of people or students, right? And so that's our whole goal and mission. Again, like we talked about before, it's almost impossible to study an entire population. So taking a sample and then using that sample to generalize to a population is a lot more feasible because again, we can address a lot of those issues of with random sampling and remove some of those extraneous variables to make sure that we have a lot of internal validity and then also the external validity that we'll talk about in this chapter. All right. So while I'm doing this, I would share my screen. As a reminder, we have an exam coming up on Thursday, and this exam will cover chapters 12, 13, and 14. So just be mindful of that as we move forward. We'll have an exam to be kind of given the same way that we've always done. You'll have the entire day to complete it on Thursday. And then also be reminded that we do have our research proposals that are due on the 30th. Okay, so I hope you're working on those things. If you need any help, again, I have office hours on Wednesday and Thursday. And then if you need to schedule the time, I'm also available to schedule the time with anybody who needs to set up an appointment to meet. But again, I'm hoping you're all working diligently on those research proposals. 100 points for the final project, final proposal. So again, make sure you give the absolute best effort and turn in your absolute best work. Also, really, really important, if you haven't done so already, to utilize the Writing Center. The Writing Center provides you with the help necessary for those grammatical punctuation errors, because I do deduct points for punctuation and grammar. So be mindful of that as we move forward. The Writing Center is a great resource. And for those who did use the Writing Center and have used the Writing Center, their scores are a lot higher because, again, they're working on the format. They're also working on the flow and punctuation and grammar to help improve the readability of your proposals. Okay, so just a plug for the Writing Center. It's located in McCaleb McIntosh, room 103. You can also email them to set up an appointment online. So again, a great resource to utilize if you haven't done so already. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Generalization, chapter 14, okay? So here are the learning objectives. So we'll talk about the various types of generalization, how we use generalization to take what we've done as researchers to make inferences about our general population, okay? So we'll discuss any issues, we'll discuss how we've used different issues regarding generalization to different results across various human identities, sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and even cultures, and how different cultures, different races, different genders, it's difficult to generalize across a lot of these different identities because different people think very differently. So we'll talk about those issues regarding those things, okay? All right, so generalizing to other populations. One of the biggest things, we talked about the different types of validity earlier in the semester. We talked about, internal validity, construct validity. We've talked about statistical validity. And then finally, we'll talk about external validity. And again, external validity is the extent to which our findings or our results of our study can be generalized to the overall population, right? So if I'm doing a study on college students, and I want to determine, I'm actually doing a study right now on um, ideas or beliefs of self-efficacy, mental health, and sense of belonging for students here at the university, right? So I may not be able to generalize that to other universities, uh, maybe say a predominantly white institution, but I may be able to do that with other similar HBCUs, right? So I might be able to, when I get those results, I may be able to generalize those results to other students at HBCUs that are very similar to Alabama A&M, but I may not to others, right? But so again, what is that extent that I can again generalize those findings to a general population? Most times, researchers are doing their research on college campuses at universities, and the most um, uh, the easiest participants to recruit are those who are at the university. Usually, those who are in classes, especially those introductory social science classes like psychology, sociology, um, political science, all of those early early first and second year classes that everyone takes at the beginning, right? So there is a heavy use of college students in research. And so the issue regarding this is, can we generalize information that we get from college students to the general population? And that's kind of been one of the biggest heartburns for researchers is, again, can I generalize this? And what we've been able to see, because you think about the different characteristics of a college student. Usually, again, they're very young. They may be a little more immature. Um, they their ideas and their beliefs may still be kind of in flux, right? And so we talk about political attitudes, we talk about their social support, we're talking about their just their ideas in general may be there might be discovering things, right? And so the way they think now may be very different than the way they think as young adults or even middle-aged adults, right? Usually, college students have high cognitive skills, right? And what we seem to have begun to think about is they are more similar to each other than they are to adults in the real world, right? You all think differently than I do, just because of our different experiences. Right now, you haven't experienced as much as I have. Maybe some of you have, but again, your ideas about um, and your attitudes and your values, all of those things are in flux right now, right? You're trying to figure out what and who you are, and oftentimes that comes with different way you respond to research. Okay. One other thing that we talk about is, again, volunteers, right? So for those who volunteer and do research at the university, though they have a specific criteria and characteristic to them, right? So usually individuals who volunteer for research, they are very different than those who don't volunteer at all, right? There's a different motivation, right? And so when we talk about volunteers and generalizing our research to other populations, we have to identify that those who went to volunteer versus those who didn't, again, they may vary in different characteristics and motivation, right? Those who tend to volunteer tend to be more highly educated. They usually have a higher socioeconomic status. Um, Sometimes they need more in need of approval, right? So they want to engage, they want to participate in order to help. And then the last one, they might be a little more social. Those who sign up for a survey, sign up to participate in the survey, may be a little more social than someone who doesn't, right? They're a little more, maybe a little more extroverted than those who decide not to. Or just you think about those who are able to participate in more research, they usually have a lot more free time, right? If I'm working 2 or 3 jobs, maybe I'm lower income, I don't have the opportunity, I don't have the energy to participate in research versus those who have higher education, have a higher socioeconomic status. They usually have a little more time and understand um, the importance of research at a different level, right? And so they'd be more apt to volunteer. And so you might see some differences and may not be able to generalize based on just those characteristics of versus those who volunteer versus those who don't, right? Also, online research, when we talk about the similarity and the effects of online research, Um, internet users are very different, right? We know that almost everyone in the United States is using some form of internet, right? 90% of individuals in the United States have or use the internet. And we think about those who use cell phones. 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, about 15, 20% of people use cell phones. Now, 85% of individuals in the United States have or use a cell phone, right? But those who use cell phones and internet more often are different, right? Those who use cell phones and internet may be a little younger. Obviously, they spend a little more time on the internet, higher socioeconomic status. Usually, they live in more suburban or urban areas, and they just again use and have maybe computer literacy skills are a little higher, right? So those different characteristics of internet users is different. So for online research and internet surveys that are taken, we have to take that into account that those who are taking our surveys may be a lot different in the characteristics for those who don't have access to our surveys. Okay. One of the other things that we talk about, one of the other issues is, can we generalize based on sex, gender, race, and other identities, right? Because if, for instance, my motivation, um, my ideas about, say, women in the workplace may be a lot different than your views about women in the workplace, right? When we talk about human resources, and we're doing surveys on, what is the idea of leadership, right? My idea of leadership as a man may be different than someone who identifies as a woman, right? So again, I would not be able to generalize my ideas to someone in another race, another ethnicity, or another gender. Right. So we have to be really cognizant of how we are generalizing things across uh, different human identities. Right. Again, sex and gender are very different. Right. Because my sex is again what I was born as biologically, right, male or female, and then my gender identity can be very different. Right. It's kind of fluid. Um, Gender could be how I identify, how I associate myself with being female or male, right? And so we have to be really, really, really cognizant of that. And then also the construct of race and ethnicity, very, very complex, right? So while I identify as African American and Black, right, um, my identification as that may be different than someone else's identification. And we may think very differently just because I'm a Black male and I'm less conservative. There are some Black males who are more conservative and may vote in different ways differently than me, right? So we have to take that into account and not just take it for granted or just kind of assume that people of same race, gender, ethnicity, sex think the same, and that is not the case at all. We're all very unique and diverse in how we respond to different research. Okay. One of the other things that we talked about, many of you have taken general psychology, and a lot of the research that was done in the past was done on individuals who were Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? And one of the keys to past research, especially in psychology, was many of them, the research was done on cisgender white men, right? So when we think about the ramifications and implications of that, a lot of the research is not generalized to other cultures, right? And when we think about even location, when I was in college, in the South we drink sweet tea, right? But in the North they drink unsweet tea. More often than not, you're going to see in a restaurant or at a dinner they're going to have unsweet tea, but in a restaurant or some type of formal event in the South, you might have a sweet tea, right? So just those different locations, we think very differently. In the South, we listen to different music. We have a different affinity for different types of sports. Culturally, we think differently than those in the West, those in the Northeast, those in the Midwest, right? So culturally, if I did a study or a survey and I was looking at, attitudes and beliefs in the United States and the Southeast region, right? I may not be able to generalize that to individuals in the Midwest or on the West Coast because, again, we're very, very different people. We think differently, and we have different attitudes, beliefs about certain topics. Okay, but again, and even with different cultures, right? even with different cultures, we have to be mindful of that. And I think it's important that we have Black researchers, we have Black psychologists, sociologists, Black criminal justice um, researchers, because it's important that we are we're incorporating different cultures, incorporating different sexes, incorporating different genders and ethnicities, because we want to be able to generalize our research to those particular identities. Okay. So you think about in the Western culture, we are more individualistic, right? But more in the Eastern culture, they're a little more collectivist, right? So when we think about self-esteem, when we think about, you know, how we handle stress, those in Eastern culture may handle stress very differently than those in the Western culture. If you think about in the Western culture, we like to be around people, we like to talk through our issues, right? But in Eastern cultures, they don't usually talk, right? They're usually, it's about, hey, I just need to be around my people. I don't necessarily have to talk, but I have an implied social support system, and that sometimes is enough for me to get through those stressful events. Versus someone in the Western culture, individualized culture, like they need to be around people, they need to talk to people, they need to talk it out so that they feel better, right? So that's the difference in how people handle stress and how people may cope with stress. There are other differences across cultures, and there are also some similarities, right? And so that's why we do cross-cultural research to determine if there are some similarities among different cultures. When we think about beauty, when we think about facial symmetry, when we think about attractiveness, those there are some similarities, and there may be some very big differences. In some African cultures, beauty is thought to be very different than what we see in the Western culture, right? So we have to be really mindful of how we view research in that way, right? So here's one. I would talk about what is beauty, right? Across culture, there is a waist to hip ratio of about zero point 0.7, and that waist to hip ratio has been studied for centuries, right? And so in Western culture and in Eastern culture, the waist to hip ratio, meaning your waist are smaller than your hips, right? And that ratio itself is again cross-cultural, right? Many individuals in each culture again prefer the waist to be smaller than the hips. And when we look at facial symmetry, right? Facial symmetry again across culture is very much the same across culture. So we know that again, beauty and the waist to hip ratio and what we identify as beauty is very similar across cultures, and we can generalize that based on research that's done. Okay. Um, the other thing that we have and have done over the last several centuries is non-human animals research, right? Can we generalize research that is done with animals to the human population? And one reason we can is because there are some underlying biological and behavioral patterns that we all, humans and animals, share, right? And so we have been able to generalize the findings from and the results from research done on animals to humans. One of the most famous studies that we talk about, especially in attachment, is Harry Harlow and this rhesus monkey study. Right. So what he did was he used these rhesus monkey. He weaned them from their mothers at a very young age, and he raised them with a cloth mother and a wire mother. The wire mother provided the sustenance and food, and the cloth mother didn't provide anything but comfort, right? And so what they were able to understand, and especially with attachment, is that the sustenance provided by the wire mother was great, right? Because it provided that basic biological need, but comfort was much more important for those rhesus monkeys because they would go feed and then they would go and be comforted. So almost 18 hours of the day, they would spend most of their time with that cloth mother because that cloth mother provided um, that comfort. So again, they spent less time feeding and more time on the cloth mother that provided that comfort. And that has been seen in the attachment styles with secure, avoidant, and anxious ambivalent attachment styles. They used other animals to kind of understand what those attachment styles would be, because there are different procedures that are required to be able to study these different studies, right? I can use animals and observe them 24/7. I can isolate them in a more humane way than I would be able to do for a human, right? So again, there are some procedures that are required that provide that basic research with non-human animals, and we're able to generalize those to human subjects. Okay. So when we talked about at the beginning the very specific characteristics of college students, one of the things that we can think through is that college students are really diverse, right? One of the first things that we talk about is college students are human beings. And again, we think very similar. You all think very similar to adults, right? And one of the biggest things is with diversity across the United States in college students, it makes it a little easier to be able to, again, generalize some of the results to the general public. And when we talk about replication, the study and the replication provides what they call a safeguard against limited external validity of just one study, right? So when we talk about replication, when we replicate particular studies on a particular construct, maybe say self-esteem or academic self-efficacy, we're able to replicate that across various universities across the country, across the world, and that provides that mixture, right? That richness of diversity, which then also provides that external validity. Right? So the more replication that we provide, the more diversity we have in our student bodies, the the better the external validity. Right? And so again, it says studies have found, right, that students can and have applied um, to other populations like children, like aging adults, right? So some of the same characteristics are seen in those same groups, right? So again, it's uh, criticism about using college students. But again, the research has been shown that, again, across replication after replication, there is some merit to the studies that have been used on college students. Okay. One other thing is just across methods, right? Are you using a interview, a survey? Are you using experimental design? All of these different methods have been used to, again, maybe test a particular construct, okay? And even with an experimental design, right, where we could control a lot more. We're looking a little more at the internal validity of a study, right? Maybe we're looking at personality, we're looking at gender, we're looking at experiences, right? Those different ways that we gather data may be and have been seen and shown to add to the robustness of research, right? Um, but when we're looking at experiments, right, the experimenter, like we talked about, experimenter bias plays a big role. However, when we replicate, we're able to kind of mitigate the experimental bias a lot because we're able to see the replication of those particular studies. Because we talked about experimenters, right? Experimenters have a different personality. Their gender may influence the study. Their experiences may also influence the study. So either increasing the number of experimenters and also replicating those particular studies one to one helps to improve and reduce that experimental bias in the long term, which then again increases the external validity for research studies. Okay. One of the other things that we do as researchers is the pre-test, post-test, right? And so when we want to generalize to a public, right? Remember when we do a random assignment, okay, completely random assignment for an experiment or research, that allows for um, you know us to be able to increase that internal validity, right? But what if we're doing random assignment on a group of males and we're not really thinking about females, right? So we may not be able to generalize that to other females, but we may be able to generalize to males because we have an unbiased sample, right? And since we randomly assigned it, we can be sure and almost certain that the results that we get are unbiased and we can generalize it and be really an external validity to that particular research study. Okay. But if we are able to have a random assignment, we are able to do pre-tests, right? The pre-test allows us to confirm if the two groups that we're studying or the groups that we're studying are equivalent. Because if you recall, when we use random assignment, we're removing any any other biases, and we're trying to ensure that those two groups aren't biased and have some equivalency to them, right? And when we know those two groups are equivalent and we compare those two groups, then the individual differences that we see, the unsystematic error that we see, again, is washed out. And then the treatment effect is what is being illuminated, right? So any differences in those two groups is associated to the treatment effect, and that's what we want to see, right? The pretest also helps to assess mortality or attrition, right? Because when you have a research study, especially longitudinal research study, maybe you come in with 250 students, but over time, there is attrition. Students drop out for various reasons. Maybe they transfer schools, they move out of the state, or they just decide to not participate in the study anymore. And we want to determine if there is a specific person, right, that is again dropping out of the study. Are are there any differences between those who completed the study, they completed the study all the way through, versus those who did not, right? And so we are able to kind of assess that based on the pretest. And what happens sometimes when we do pretest, the pretest can affect the post-test. So what we remember, we can use a Solomon 4 group design where you give half, you split your group in half. Say you have 100 participants, you split that 100 participants in half. You give half of them a pre-test and a post-test, and the second half you just give a post-test. And you want to see if there's an effect that is measured by just giving somebody a pre-test, because we know that if you give a pre-test, it can affect the scores and the dependent variable on that post-test. So you want to see if there's any effect whatsoever of that pretest, and that's how you would do it with the Solomon 4 group design. Okay. One of the other issues regarding external validity is, can we generalize our studies from laboratory settings, right? When we look at laboratory settings they give us a lot of control, right? But in the real world, in experiments, right, especially field experiments, we don't have as much control, right? So if we're looking at particular constructs, maybe we're looking at depression or self-esteem, maybe leadership in the laboratory setting versus an experiment, a field experiment, we're going to see some differences, right? What we think we would, right? So does the artificiality of a laboratory limit the ability to generalize the results, right? And so what we've seen over the course of various studies, and research have been done in the experiment, in laboratory, and in the field experiment, the results are pretty similar, right? So even though there may be some differences in effect sizes are, pretty similar, right? And the results that are achieved are very similar in the laboratory setting versus the field experiment. And these two sets of results generally complement one another because, again, we're removing some of the extraneous variables in the laboratory experiment, and we're unable to do so in the field experiment. But with those results being very similar, again, they complement and they increase the external validity, right? So having laboratory experiment and then you confirm it with a field experiment is oftentimes really beneficial and increases that external validity for your research. Okay. So what happens when we talk about generalizing to a different group? We talked about those human identities, right? We talked about gender, we talked about age, ethnic group. Sometimes different ethnic groups, different races, different genders respond differently to different constructs, right? To different phenomena. And so we have to be really mindful of that when we're looking at research, okay? So when we use census, when we use a random sample, we'll always produce better external validity than a non-random sample, right? So again, like we talked about, we want to be able to eliminate all those different characteristics that might specify or make someone really specific to a particular group. So when we do a random sample, that eliminates that and oftentimes produces a better external validity. But the problem with generalization, again, can be thought of as an interaction with what we call a factorial design. We'll talk about what that is on the next slide with some examples, right? But there may be some interactions that kind of will rely on gender, ethnicity, or race, right? You think about aggression, right? Men have been shown to be maybe a little more aggressive than females, right? And so when we do a study, there may be some interaction in aggressiveness scores for men than there are for women. There might be the mean aggression score for men or a man may be a little higher, significantly higher than those of women. And we have to be mindful of that when we're doing our experiments, because again, I can't generalize aggression, right, to from man to female, because again, they act very differently in their aggression scores, right? The existence of an interaction action effect can be determined by including other variables, right? So while aggression may be very different, when we incorporate a different variable, say crowding, right? Think about going to shop during Christmas, right? The aggression level usually goes up a little higher for those who are male than it does for those who are female, right? They feel a little more aggression in a really, really crowded space versus um, a female who may not feel uh, as much aggression in a really, really crowded space, but depending on the context. Okay. So again, when you influence or introduce additional variables, you start to see those interactions, and you may not be able to generalize from one group to the next based on those additional variables that you incorporate. Okay, so here's a hypothetical example. Here are four hypothetical situations where, in these situations, you see some interactions and you also see no interaction whatsoever. Right. So in group graph A and graph B, um, you see on the right on the x-axis at the bottom, you have low crowding and you have high crowding. So this study is measuring how the crowding of individuals in a particular space increases the aggression or decreases the aggression. So as you see in each four of the graphs, the relationship from low to high for males aggression is the same. Okay. The only thing that is changing is the relationship with females. Okay. So in graph A, there is identical aggression from males to females, right? So if I were to try to generalize from male to female, then I could probably generalize aggression, especially when I introduce crowding from male to female, because they're identical in group graph A. And you may be also to generalize aggression in male to female in graph B. There is a higher aggression level, but they are increasing at the same level, on the same plane, right? So the aggression level may be a little lower in females, but again, we're not really studying aggression level. We're looking at how aggression is affected by about the level of crowding in a particular space. However, in graph C and graph D, you do see an interaction, right? So there is no interaction whatsoever with crowding in graph C, but there again you see that increase from low to high in aggression from males, right? How in graph D you see another interaction, right? So with males, aggression increases, right? But with females, aggression decreases, right? So I would not be able to generalize aggression and crowding for males and females in these last two examples. And oddly enough, graph D has been confirmed in research over the last several decades, where crowding, the level of crowding, um, increases aggression in males, but decreases aggression in females on average, right? So again, being able to generalize really depends on how you incorporate different variables and what that might look like with factorial designs. Okay. One other thing that's really important for supporting good external validity is replicating, right? So we talked about in using college students. When we're using a really diverse group of college students and then we replicate those studies over and over and over again and we get very similar results, that again leads to increased external validity. When we talk about replication again is a way of overcoming any problems of generalization that occur in just one single study, right? So when we want to know about external validity, you want to increase external validity, you want to increase the replication. You can do either an exact replication where you're replicating precisely every procedure in the study. That's why in your research proposals, I'm asking that you are really specific, because some individuals may want to replicate your study exactly, right? And so with that replication, they want to see if the results that you got match the results that they are hoping to receive. right? Which then increases the external validity. And the second one is conceptual replication, right? So they may use different procedures than yours, but you all are studying the same construct, right? And they want to replicate those same findings of that same construct based on very different research uh, procedures, right? And so that's conceptual, where they're using the same concept or construct, but they're using different procedures. So you have an exact replication and you have a conceptual replication, which is using different procedures to replicate the research findings that you got. Okay. One other thing that we see that you may have seen is with external validity, um, literature review plays a big part in, again, identifying a number of studies who, again, have similar results. Right? So when I'm doing a literature review, I'm looking for research that is supporting my particular views and hypotheses. And what you see is, again, you're able to get a summary, okay? And you're able to see the different research findings. Are they consistent? Are they not? Right? And you're able to determine if there are some inconsistencies in the research that you find, right? So the literature review provides that opportunity to test for generalization and external validity, right? It informs the reader of which findings are strongly supported, and then also those that are inconsistent. And it discusses future directions of research, right? But one of the biggest keys is when you see consistency in the research, right, across various studies, you can, again, get and understand that there's a higher level of external validity there, okay? One of the other things that we talk about in research, especially when we're looking to see external validity, is meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is also looking, they use the literature review and they take very, very similar studies and they look at the effect sizes of those particular studies to determine if the effect size is very similar across various studies. Because the effect size measure is the standard, right? It's one of the standard statistical tools that we use to be able to compare from across particular studies, right? Now, the results may be very different, right? The t-test, the f-ratio, um, the correlation may be very different, but I can always compare and average effect size measures because they are less affected by the data that you collect and more so based on the effect, the differences, the relationship that you see, okay? And so here's an example. So there is several studies that were done on uh, the relationship between weight and self-esteem. Okay, I think there are some 58 studies that were meta-analyzed to determine if, again, there was a relationship between weight and self-esteem. Right, and they looked at the effect sizes of each of these 58 research studies, and what they were able to see was that there is a relationship, right? There's a moderate to low to moderate relationship between someone's self-esteem and their weight, right? And we'll look at that next, right? But the meta-analysis allows you to draw those conclusions because you're able to average across those various studies that effect size. Again, effect size, maybe Cohen's D, we talked about R squared. Again, we talked about various effect sizes that could be averaged across studies. So here's an example of those, again, those 58 studies, they averaged those studies together. And so what the research shows when we talk about effect size of R, there's a very, very, very moderate effect size for the overall relationship between weight and self-esteem, right? There's a negative relationship. So the higher your weight, the lower your self-esteem, right? There's a negative relationship there. There is also a negative relationship of actual weight and perceived weight, right? So if you perceive yourself to weigh more than you actually are, there's a bigger correlation for those who perceive themselves to be heavier. They have a lower self-esteem. Males and females view weight very differently, and so their self-esteem is differently. So there's not much of a difference. It's a 4.04 difference, but again, males seem to have be affected less by weight and their self-esteem. And then when we look at socioeconomic status, um, low, medium, middle, and high, those who have a higher socioeconomic status usually take weight a little more seriously and have lower self-esteem based on their weight. Okay. And then finally, when we talk about just research, right? Research generally and how we are able to generalize to different populations and apply it, right? I'm big on applied research. When we talk about applied research, it allows us to influence and impact various areas across um, different sectors, different businesses, um, and just in different areas of our life, right? So the impact of psychological research, the impact of sociology research and social work research has been felt in health, has been felt in law and criminal justice, education, and in work environments. And so in health, right, and improving programs and interventions to, improve positive behaviors related to stress, related to cardiovascular disease. We make those connections and correlations based on, you know, a higher stress level leads to higher incidences of a cardiovascular disease, right? And so we've been able to study that over this last several years to determine that that's a mitigating factor, right? Law and criminal justice, right? They used to use six-person jury, and now they're using 12-person jury. And psychological research was able to determine that a 12-person jury gives uh, individuals a better opportunity to weigh the facts and the evidence of a crime and make a more accurate judgment of innocent versus guilty. Right? Education. Right now, I'm doing a study on what are those factors that contribute to academic success, persistence, and retention at the university. And so we're using self-efficacy, sense of belonging, and mental health as factors, right? Are those factors contributing to academic success, persistence, and retention? And what are those interventions? What are those services that need to be provided so that we're increasing and encouraging academic performance? And then in working environments, right? I've worked in human resources as well, and you know, what are the different types and styles of leadership that lead to higher productivity in the workplace, right? Is improving and increasing employee autonomy, improving productivity in the workplace? Is the diversity in our workplace leading to higher revenue, higher work productivity, higher work morale, right? So all of those things, again, play a big role in how we view the workplace. And psychologists, sociologists, applied sociologists have been able to study these things and have had a major uh, impact in these areas related to the psychological research. Okay. The last thing we talk about, just in providing information to the general public and the lay persons, different online resources like Psychology Today. I use it often. We have individuals who write blogs and present their research at conferences. Right, all of these things provide lay people with an opportunity to understand, parenting practices and how education works for children, and mental health and how mental health is uh, viewed, and the stigma in mental health, and how do we reduce the stigma of mental health, right? So again, all of us have used internet, right, to again look up information about certain phenomena, certain constructs, and again, psychological research has been able to do that at a very very high level. Okay, so that is it for chapter 14. Be mindful of, again, the review and discussion questions at the end of the chapter. If you can answer these questions, you will do extremely well in the exam. Again, be mindful that exam will be on Thursday. So be studying the slides, be looking over the lecture slides. Again, be looking and answering these these review questions, because that'll help you be a lot more successful at the exam form. Okay. If you need any assistance, if you need any help, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will be available via email, via Blackboard. Also, just come into office hours Wednesday or Thursday. I'm available to meet whenever to help in any way I can. Okay. But I hope you all are doing well. Hope to see you all soon. Good luck on the exam 4, and have a great rest of your semester.